On today's episode of Wengel's Workshop, I'll be making an EDC knife from Alabama Damascus. If you're unfamiliar with my channel, I tell the story behind various knife builds. If that seems like something that would interest you, please consider liking and subscribing. As you can see, so far I've traced the template out onto the steel, and now I'm using an angle grinder to cut it out. Once I have the profile roughed out, I'll head over to the 2x72 grinder and dial it in. And now, as always, I will finish the profile by turning my machine horizontal and grinding all the lines parallel to the length of the blade. This will make it easier to mark out my bevel lines later. Now I'll drill out my pinholes and a few extra holes that will allow the epoxy to run through and connect the scales together. Now to help remove some additional weight in the tang, I will use the bottom wheel of my grinder to grind in some fullers in the tang. And now for the last step, prior to grinding my bevels, I will use a magnetic handle to surface grind both sides of the knife up to 220 grit. This doesn't have to do with the build, but this vegetable was saying rude things about my mother, so I used the knife that I made prior to this knife to teach him a lesson. Now I use a drill bit and some layout fluid to mark out the bevel lines. Now I'll grind in the bevels. Starting with an aggressive angle, I will bring the initial bevel up to the layout line, and then I'll proceed to bring it down the spine slowly. It's difficult to get the false bevels just right on the grinder, so I always come back and draw file them to flatten them out. Now for the heat treatment, I will do a couple normalization cycles on the knife, and here I'm heating up a chain. I'll use this to heat the oil prior to the quench. I've actually moved over to Parks 50, so I'm pretty excited about that. But once the oil is heated and I've done the normalization cycles, I will bring the knife up just past non-magnetic, and I will try to hold it at that temperature for 5 to 10 minutes prior to quenching. After the quench, I will clamp it between two pieces of steel. I tried to fully soak the knife and keep it under the oil. For some reason, I still had the surface catch on fire. I don't know whether I just need to keep it submerged more or what. I don't know. Maybe someone could tell me what the issue is. But thankfully, since it's a canister, it's no problem putting it out. I can just close the lid. Now, it's super important to take all the safety precautions in this situation. I always wear a respirator when I do my heat treatment. I have fire-resistant gloves on. And I also have a fire extinguisher on hand close by that is working. It's super important. There's an episode of the Work For It podcast where he talked about potentially losing his shop had he not had a fire extinguisher on hand. So please get a fire extinguisher, put one in your kitchen, make sure your family knows where it is. Have one in your garage. You'll never regret having one, and you will always regret not having one. Now once the quench was done, I tempered the knife in the oven for 2 cycles at about 390 degrees, 395 degrees for 2 hours apiece. After that, I cleaned the knife up on the belt grinder, and now I will hand sand the knife from 220 up to 1000 grit. Now for the part that's a little bit unique about this knife, the bullets that are casted into the scales. I cast the bullets like separately and then grind down those little pieces and then glue them to a liner and glue the whole scale set up. So I'll grind the scales down and get them lined up just right, and then I'll clamp them to the knife and drill out the pinholes. Once the pinholes are drilled, I will grind the scales flush to the knife. I was using a flush trim router bit to do this, but it is a little bit dangerous with how close your fingers are. I had some people point that out, so I've kind of moved away from the danger of that. I still use the router to do the round over. It's just much less dangerous than the flush trim bit is, so I kind of tried to balance that out. And then here I'm grinding the angle where the scales will touch the knife, as it would be very difficult to do this once they're glued to the knife. And now that the knife is ready to be glued up, it's time to go ahead and etch the Damascus. I'll be using ferric chloride to etch it. I do 2 basically quick etches, cleaning it between etches and using baking soda to neutralize the acid. After that, I will do a coffee etch, and then the Damascus will be done and the knife will be ready to be glued up. Now I'll go ahead and clean all the parts of the knife very well with acetone, and then I will use West Systems G-Flex epoxy to epoxy the scales to the knife. So here's the final result after gluing the scales to the knife. I'll go ahead and snip the pins off and grind them flush, and then I will head over to the round over bit on the router to start shaping the scales. Now I'll head back over to the grinder to rough out a Coke bottle shape into the handle. Now I'll go ahead and clean up all the shaping with a file, and then I will hand sand the entire handle up to 600, and then I will take the epoxy area and wet sand it from 600 up to 1000. And then to finish the handle up, I will use some buffing compound on a buffing wheel, and I will polish the handle up. And then we'll head back to the grinder to put on our final edge. Starting with a 120 grit belt, I create an even secondary bevel across both sides until I have an even burr all the way down the edge. Once I get that, I will move up to 220, 320, and then 400 grit. I would go higher, but I don't have any higher belts. And then I'll go ahead and finish out on a honing rod and a strop. And now here is the final result with the sheath. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And if you want to be notified when I upload new videos, hit that notification bell. You could also check me out on Instagram. I'd really appreciate a follow there. As always, thanks for watching.